Motus, M-O-T-U-S. First of all, it's not an acronym. It doesn't stand for anything. It's the Latin word for movement. And it is, as I say, a revolution in migration research. I mean, migration, I think for all of us who are birders, migration is the most exciting time of the year. For scientists, migration is the most difficult part of a bird's annual cycle to study. They're in movement. That's one thing. They're flying in many cases thousands and thousands of feet overhead. They're moving hundreds or thousands of miles in a short period of time. And of course, a lot of that migration is happening at night, and not just for species like owls that are normally nocturnal. I mean, even diurnal songbirds, passerines like this golden-winged warbler, birds that are usually active in the daytime, do most of their migration at night. Now, we've got techniques for studying nocturnal migration. Doppler radar is incredibly powerful, can tell us how many individual birds are flying over, for example, northern Illinois on any given night during the spring and fall migration. But the details of the migration, what species are where they're going, how far they're traveling, those have really been hard to study. Now, if you're studying a relatively big bird, Dennis mentioned the fact that I'm involved with Project Snowstorm. We've been studying snowy owls for the last 12 years or so. A snowy owl can weigh as much as 6.5 pounds. You can put a 45-gram transmitter on the back of a snowy owl, and it's still only 2 or 3% of that bird's body weight. After a while, it's not even going to notice it anymore. If, on the other hand, you put a 45-gram transmitter on the back of a 30-gram Swainson's thrush, you're not going to get any migration data at all because the bird's not going to be able to move. And if you're talking about really small birds, like this Kirtland's warbler that weighs less than half an ounce, until recently, it's been impossible to track these birds in real time across any meaningful distance, unless you have an air force and can follow these birds in real time with an airplane and a radio transmitter. But that has changed in the last 10 years or so, thanks to the Motus Wildlife Tracking System. This is the brainchild of Birds Canada, what used to be called Bird Studies Canada. Birds Canada is basically the Canadian equivalent of the National Audubon Society. And the Motus system, the genius here on the part of Birds Canada is that it marries two existing technologies, these hyper miniaturized radio transmitters, VHF radio transmitters. They've been around for decades and decades and decades, but they're small enough now that they can, some of these things are like 0.13 grams, about 4/100ths of an ounce. Transmitters that are small enough to put on not just the smallest birds like hummingbirds, but even on migratory insects like butterflies and dragonflies. And then to track their movement with automated receiver stations, a network of them growing across the continent, increasingly across the hemisphere. And so for the first time, we can track all of these migratory organisms across, in some cases, hemispheric distances where we've never been able to do that before. These receiver stations, so another cool thing about Motus is that all of the transmitters operate on a single frequency. There's two different frequencies, 166 megahertz and 434 megahertz, and you don't have to remember those numbers. But all of the receivers on 166 megahertz can pick up all of the tags that go past them. 15 years ago, I studied saw-whet owls using standard VHF radio telemetry. We'd spend all night in the woods with a directional antenna in our hand and a receiver, and every owl had a different frequency. And so you had to keep skipping from frequency to frequency to frequency in order to track these owls. That doesn't work if you're trying to track hundreds or thousands of individuals, but because all of the transmitters operate on the same frequency and all of the receivers can pick up any of those tags, any tagged bird or bat or bug that flies past any of these receiver stations is going to be detected by it. And so the result of this is this really revolutionary new approach to tracking these tiny little animals. And most migratory birds are under 50 grams. So most of these are animals that we've never been able to track before across these really enormous distances. And it's growing rapidly. There are now somewhere in the neighborhood of about 2,200 of these Motus receivers scattered, as you can see, primarily around North America, but increasingly in Latin America and the Caribbean. And it's starting to gain some traction in places like Australia and Europe. And if I want to zoom in a little bit closer, you can see that Motus has until recently been primarily an Eastern an Eastern phenomenon. And that's because Birds Canada is based in Ontario. That's where they started. By the way, this color-coded chart here, this map, all of those little dots obviously represent Motus receiver stations. The ones in yellow only pick up the 166 megahertz tags, which are made by a company called Low-Tech in Canada. There's a few blue ones scattered in there. They only pick up the 434 megahertz tags that are made by a company called Cellular Tracking Technologies in New Jersey. And you can see that most of the tags are purple, most of the dots are purple because those are stations that are dual mode. They pick up both the 166 and the 434 because why discriminate? As I said, the Motus network's been growing exponentially. It only started in 2013, and it's now more than 2,000 receiver stations, 34 countries, 5 continents, about just under 900 projects studying birds and bats and migratory insects, involving about 2,800 partners and collaborators who have tagged more than 51,000 individuals of more than 400 species of birds and bats and insects. And at this point, they have given up trying to tally up how many billions of detections they've gotten. Because the data, as you're going to see a little bit later when we start to dig into this, has really been extraordinary. It's a fire hose of information about what these migratory animals are doing. Now, I got involved with Motus before it was Motus. Back in the fall of 2012, my good buddy Dave Brinker from the Maryland Department of Natural Resources, the founder of Project OwlNet, which is a collaboration of hundreds of primarily saw-whet owl banding stations across Canada and the United States, he and I had been hearing about this nanotag technology and these automated receiver stations. And we decided to do a pilot project in the mountains of central Pennsylvania to find out whether it was possible to use this tech to track the local and regional movements of tagged saw-whet owls. And so we hired a team of enthusiastic and highly skilled young wildlife biologists as our research technicians, and we built a whole bunch of these automated receiver stations at 4 locations in the mountains of central Pennsylvania. And we tagged about 40 saw-whet owls over the course of that fall, and it worked really, really well. In fact, it worked so well that we went back to the small private family foundation that was supporting our work and said, we would like to roll this out on a bigger scale in 2013 and tag a lot more owls and set up a lot more stations and track these birds across a wider area. And they said yes, and they gave us a pot of money to do that. But at the same time, we heard through the grapevine that the folks at what was then still called Bird Studies Canada, who were experimenting with the same technology up at Long Point on the north shore of Lake Erie, had come up with this killer idea to build out a network across North America of these receiver stations. And we realized that if we could help them do that, we could do a much better job of tracking saw-whet owls, not just in central Pennsylvania, but perhaps across their entire migration route. So with the permission from that family foundation, we set that money aside, and we'll come back to this a little bit later, what we're finally doing with that money now, all these years later. But in 2015, Dave and a number of other colleagues of ours, including Lisa Kishuk there from the Willistown Conservation Trust in southeastern Pennsylvania, we formed what we called the Northeast Motus Collaboration, because we realized up to that point, the receiver stations that were being set up really just on a project by project basis. Like, for example, this is the map from 2013, 2014, somewhere in that area. And there were some folks in southern Indiana that were interested in bat migration, and they set up a whole bunch of stations in southern Indiana just to study bats. Now, of course, those stations picked up any other tagged organism that happened to fly by carrying one of these nanotags. But we realized instead of just doing this on a project by project basis, what if we just decided to build out this receiver infrastructure on a regional basis? And so we started raising money from private donors initially. Then we got a little bit of money from the Pennsylvania Department of Conservation and Natural Resources. And in 2017, we started building a network in Pennsylvania. And we started with a line across Pennsylvania from northwest to southeast, from Philadelphia to Lake Erie. And then over the course of the next year or two, we got funding from the Richard King Mellon Foundation in Western Pennsylvania. We got some more money From the state, we got about $1 million from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service through their competitive state wildlife grant. We built out the network in the Mid-Atlantic. Starting in 2020, we had another big grant from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to build out a Motus network across New England and New York, so that by the time we finished all this work in the fall of 2023, we had about 160 of these receiver stations, basically from the eastern shore of Maryland all the way up into Maine and upstate New York. We are now the second largest operator of Motus stations in the entire global Motus network, second only to Birds Canada. And more recently, we've been working, again, with funding from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service with partners in the Southeast to build out the network across the southeastern states, where there's still a fairly large gap in the network. So it's been incredible to watch this thing grow. We've also been, oh, there we go. Whoops, let me just go back one. And this just gives you a sense of what that network has produced. And I'm going to take you to the Motus website in a little bit. We'll do some live demonstration to show you how you can play around with all this data yourself, because all of this data is publicly available. But this map shows all of the detections for all the birds and bats and bugs that have gone through the Northeast Motus Collaboration's network since we started in 2017. This is the power of Motus. It shows us where in real time these migratory animals are going. It's opening up the black box of migration in a way that has never been possible before. The other thing that we've been doing with the Northeast Motus Collaboration is sharing what we've learned. We were the first regional Motus collaboration, but there are many others, and we've been helping them both here in the United States and abroad to get started. In fact, one of the things that we've been doing a lot in the last couple of years is working in the Caribbean with Birds Caribbean, and also in Central America with partners down there, doing capacity building. The handsome bearded fellow in the middle of all of those pictures is Todd Alliger, who started with the Northeast Motus Collaboration. He now works for the American Bird Conservancy as their Atlantic Flyway Motus coordinator. And these are photographs of workshops that Todd's been doing in places like Puerto Rico and the Dominican Republic, building capacity down there, teaching scientists and conservationists in those areas how to build and set up and maintain these receiver stations, and really engineering the heck out of them in hurricane zones like the Caribbean, because we don't want them to blow over. And it's not just what we're doing in the Northeast. This is a map showing where all the organisms that have gone through the Illinois Motus network have come from and gone to. This is the Illinois Motus network. I think there's 32 receiver stations in the state of Illinois that Mike Avera at University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign has been managing. And again, I'm going to show you in a little bit how you can go in and explore all this stuff and look in detail at what is literally coming through your backyard. In the case of the Illinois Motus Network, you've got Swainson's thrushes that are coming from British Columbia. You have eastern whippoorwills. I mean, when I was playing around with this data over the last couple of days and just familiarizing myself with what's going through Illinois, it really makes clear how the Midwest is the crossroads of migration in North America. You've got Swainson's thrushes and nighthawks coming from Montana and British Columbia. Eastern whippoorwills. By the way, that eastern whippoorwill that is highlighted right there, one of my former owl banding volunteers, who's now a graduate student at the University of Guelph in Ontario. That's one of Alora's birds. I was rather pleased to see that. So we've got all this information. What good is it? What are we doing with that information? Now, information is power. We've seen really frightening declines in bird populations over the last number of decades. With this information, I think we are finally at the cusp of being able to start to turn things around for these birds. For example, if we don't know where the problems are, we don't know where to start looking for ways to try to fix it. I think most of us are aware of the fact that aerial insectivores like swallows and swifts have been in really serious decline for a long, long time. And some of these birds migrate incredible distances. Barn swallows from North America, many of them spend the winter in Argentina. And so the problems that are driving their populations down could be anywhere along that 9,000-mile migration route. So before we just start flailing around trying to figure out how to save these birds, let's figure out where the problems are. And so one of the ways that we can do that is using Motus. And so a couple of years ago, Birds Canada and some of their partners realized they've got this really dense network of Motus stations in southern Ontario, between Lakes Ontario and Erie and Lake Huron. And so they tagged, oh, I can't remember the number now, well more than 100 fledgling barn swallows with these tiny little nano tags, and followed them in the weeks after they left their nest to find out what were their survival rates. Nobody had ever had the opportunity to track these birds. It's really, really hard to track even a single bird with traditional VHF wildlife telemetry. But with the Motus network, the receivers do all the work for you. And what they found was that about 60% of those young swallows don't live long enough to actually depart on their first migration. The problems, at least a significant part of the problems for barn swallows, obviously lie there on the breeding ground in Ontario. And frankly, it probably has to do with declining numbers of insect abundances, things like neonicotinoid insecticides that are driving down insect populations pretty much everywhere. This is actionable conservation information that gives us a handle on where the problems are and where we can start to figure out ways to correct them. But there's some really cool and innovative work that's being done with the Motus network. Some of our Northeast Motus collaboration colleagues at the Powder Mill Nature Reserve in southwestern Pennsylvania realized that, look, about 1 billion birds a year die flying into windows in North America. And the ones that survive, we don't know how well those birds are able to navigate. Are they able to migrate normally? And so what they've been doing over the last couple of years is working with rehabilitators who, put a lot of time and effort and frankly emotional investment into trying to save birds that have flown into windows that were not immediately killed, and then get them back in the wild. But again, are those birds back in the wild able to function normally? And so by tagging both rehabilitated window strike victims that went back in the wild and birds of the same species that had not hit windows, and then comparing their migration timing, distance, direction, and behavior, they found that actually these birds, their survival in rehab is pretty high. The rehabilitated birds had similar survival and similar migration behavior, although their migration is obviously delayed because of the time they spent in rehab. So it's a little bit of good news that these birds, if they can make it out of rehab, they've got a pretty good chance. The Motus network is big enough now, and we've sort of reached this critical mass in receiver coverage across North America, the Caribbean, and parts of Latin America, that we can ask some really big, ambitious questions, questions with significant conservation implications. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the status and trends maps that eBird rolled out a couple of years ago. If not, these are an incredible resource. I really urge you to go to the eBird page and look them up under the Science tab. And they show us where bird populations are rising and where bird populations are decreasing. And this is the map, the status and trend map for wood thrush. And if you've been a birder for any length of time, you're probably aware of the fact that wood thrush populations were in steep decline, gosh, as far back as the 1960s. And since the 1980s, we've been pouring, as a conservation community, a tremendous amount of time and effort into managing woodland habitats to try to reverse the decline of wood thrushes. And here's some good news. It has worked. Wood thrush populations are by and large up across most of their range. This is, a fairly rare window of good news, and it shows that we can make a difference for these birds. But as you can also see, up here in New Hampshire, where I live in the Northeast, wood thrushes are still in trouble. And the question is why? Well, we know that a lot of birds, including wood thrushes, have where you have distinct regional breeding populations. Those populations also have distinct regional wintering areas. So they don't just all kind of flow evenly across their wintering grounds. And so is a very good chance that the reason that wood thrushes here in the Northeast are still struggling is that there's something along their specific migration route or their specific wintering area in southern Mexico or Central America that is holding these birds back. And to try to figure out where those problems are, there's a really ambitious program going on right now. We're in the middle of this 3-year project from 2024 to 2026, being spearheaded by Sarah Kendrick at the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, where dozens and dozens and dozens of collaborators across the entirety of the wood thrush breeding range in North America and across all of their wintering range in Latin America are going to be tagging somewhere between 600 and 1,000 wood thrushes over the course of the next 3 years to figure out exactly where all of these different regional populations are going. What routes are they using? What stopover areas are they using? And what wintering areas are they using? That's going to give us, again, actionable conservation information that we can use to start to turn the dial toward recovery everywhere for the wood thrush, and not just in part of its range. And the Motus network is generating a huge amount of science. There are hundreds of papers that have been published over the last couple of years using Motus data, identifying critical stopover areas, wintering areas, seeing where those choke points are in their migration. For many of these species of birds, we don't have this really basic information. And without that information, we can't make informed conservation decisions. So what I want to do now is pause for a moment and show you how you can play around with the Motus website, because as I said, all of this cool information is publicly available. And you can find out exactly what's going on, like what birds are flying over your house at night by watching Motus. And so what I'm going to have to do here is stop screen sharing for a moment and switch from my slide presentation to an active browser. So bear with me for just a moment. So this is a landing page for the Motus website, and there's a couple of things you can do here. We've got this map down here, and you can just scroll in. All of those little dots, obviously, are Motus stations, and they're all clickable. So I'm just going to zoom in on Illinois, and let's kind of randomly pick one here. So this is the 10 Mile Creek Motus Station. It's been active. It's been up since, looks like July 31st of last year. And right here it says tags detected 5. And I'm just going to click on table, which will tell me what they've been seeing. Okay. So we've got nighthawk, a couple of wood thrushes, 3 wood thrushes and red-eyed vireo. And I'm just going to click on the nighthawk. So this is a nighthawk that was tagged at the Intermountain West Birds. This is at MPG Ranch in Montana. That's Matt Webb and his group. They've been doing a tremendous amount of work out there. If you're interested in learning a little bit more about the project, you can click on that and it'll tell you who's there, what they've tagged, lots of cool Western birds. But we're interested in this particular nighthawk. And so down here, you can show the detections as a table, a timeline. I like the map because it's going to show us exactly where this bird has been. And, oh, very cool. So just scroll this up. And I'm going to pull this up into a whole window. We've actually got multiple years worth of migration here for this bird. So let's see, we're going to zoom in. So this is MPG Ranch up in Montana. This is obviously where the bird was tagged, and that's obviously its nesting area up there. And each of these, it's having a little, I guess because I'm running my video, my internet's having a little bit of a hard time generating the map. But each of these legs, so let's see, so this was the northbound migration of this bird in June on its way back. It hit the coast at Aransas National Wildlife Refuge. That's where the whooping cranes spend the winter. Hit there on June 15th, and from June 15th to June, I think that was 28th, is how long it took to get back up to Montana. As it came through, what I find remarkable here is how close. This is probably, let's see, that was southbound migration in August and September of 2023, and there's southbound migration in August and September of 2024. That is a remarkably similar route. That bird knew what 7-Elevens it wanted to hit on its way south.
Hmm.
And then all the way down to, well, I can't see that. Hang on, it's gonna catch up here in a minute. I apologize for how slow my internet is. I'm guessing that's northern South America. The one we went, there we go. Yeah, oh yeah, northern Colombia. So it hit northern Colombia on September 23rd, having flown probably down right across the middle of the Caribbean. Let's see what else we've got here. So that was the Nighthawk. Oh, I've got to find out what Fatty Birds is. Choosing the right fuel. So this is a project. Western University is in Ontario, and they're tagging red-eyed vireos, testing the hypothesis about polyunsaturated fats affect diet choice and migratory performance in birds. And one of their red-eyed vireos came through, and we'll see where that came from. So their Western University is in Southern Ontario, as I said, and so this bird came down through the Midwest and hit that 10-mile, I think it was 10 Mile Creek sour. So that's one way that you can play around with the Motus, the Motus data. You can do it that way. The other thing you can do is go to what they call the dashboard. And I'm a little bit concerned that if it's being a bit slow to load, that I'm going to ask it to show us a lot of data here. So I may have to ask your indulgence and your patience while this loads. I guess I could try turning off my camera. Why don't I do that? I'm just going to turn off my camera for the moment and see if that saves me a little bit of. We're going to watch the bouncing bird and bat and bug. Well, that's a shame because this is the really cool stuff. And I would encourage you to explore it. Oh, here we go. All of a sudden, it worked just fine. So this is what they call the dashboard, the Motus dashboard. And you can find that, go to the landing page and go to About, and then you can pull up the dashboard. You can see all those color-coded locations. You can look at the stations. You can look by project. There's all of the projects. That'll tell you how many organisms, how many individual animals and species they've tagged. Um, you can do that by species if you're interested. If you're just dying to know where Baird sandpiper has been going on its migration, you can find that. Or you can go to regions. And this is what I'm really hoping works because this is the dazzling part. There we go. I'm going to choose the United States. And you can see that there have been about 20,000 individual animals of about 250 species that have been tagged. And it's going to load the data. And this usually does take at least a couple of moments because it's an enormous amount of data that it's loading here. Yes. Okay. So that's everything that's been detected on the United States, on the Motus receivers in the United States. And all of those little threads are clickable. But what I want to do is go to full page, and you can animate this. And this is like watching a fireworks show. So we're going to start this, and it's going to start in 2013 when there was almost no Motus network. There's a little bit of stuff going on up there in Nova Scotia. There's a bird that's flying out to Cape Sable Island, which is 250 miles off the coast. And then a few birds going north and a few birds going south. Down here at the bottom, we just went through 2014. We're into 2015 now. Things are starting to pick up a little bit more, but there's still not much of a Motus network. This was before we'd even started doing our work in the Northeast. Coming into 2016 now, it's getting a little bit more impressive. A lot of birds coming down out of the Arctic. Those are mostly shorebirds that Birds Canada has been tagging up on the high Canadian Arctic on the coast of Hudson Bay and James Bay. Some birds down to the coast of South America. Again, those are almost all shorebirds moving back and forth. Down here at the bottom, there's going through about 20 2018, moving into 2019 now, building some capacity, more and more colorful. Each of those different colors represents a different project, not just a different species. Not a whole lot in 2020. Other things were happening in 2020. People had other priorities rather than the Motus network. But once we got into 2021, a lot of folks at that point were excited about Motus, um, getting more and more birds and bats and bugs moving. A lot of Swainson's thrushes coming out of southern British Columbia there. That's a woman named Kristen Rogue who's been doing a lot of really cool work on hybridization in different populations of hermit thrush, or excuse me, of Swainson's thrushes. This is 2023. We're kind of building to the grand finale. And last year, 2024, it's a tidal wave of animals moving north, an enormous wave of them moving back south again. I just find that cool. And then, as I said, if we drop out of full page, you can zoom in and see any one of these things. So for example, if you're interested in this particular Lewis's woodpecker, click on that, click on View Animal. And okay, that Lewis's woodpecker from MPG Ranch didn't go all that far, but nevertheless, it's one of 51,000 birds, bats, and insects whose migration you can track on Motus. I will warn you, this is addictive. You can spend hours on this and not realize that you have spent hours on this. I have been known to do that myself. You may also discover as you explore Motus data some tracks that don't make any sense because the way Motus works, each of these tags is emitting a coded identification pulse at it's a certain, it's kind of like Morse code. It's a certain code at a certain pulse rate, a certain repetition rate, maybe every 13.7 seconds or 13.9 seconds. And all of the data goes back to Birds Canada, and they have filters. And unless that particular code and that particular pulse rate has repeated a certain number of times, and I'm not really sure what it is, but it's half a dozen or more, it gets filtered out because there's a lot of electromagnetic radiation out there, and you get a lot of false positives. Even with those filters in place, sometimes bad stuff gets in. And so you may occasionally see, well, for example, there is a northern saw-whet owl detection in northern Colombia in South America. Northern saw-whet owls do not occur in South America. But if you've got enough billions and billions of detections, every once in a while, some noise is going to seep in around all of the signal. So anyway, that is a little bit of a live demo on exploring Motus. There's a ton of resources that you can explore on their website, including if you're an educator, there's material there for working with Motus with students. There's a million different ways that you can explore the data. You can look at particular projects. I just want to say, I mentioned before that we had this pot of money that we got many, many, many years ago from a foundation whose principal actually has died in the years since then. But with the family's permission, we hung on to this money. Now that we've built out this enormous Motus network, we are finally doing the saw-whet owl study that we envisioned more than 12 years ago. And working with a young University of Delaware student named Aaron Kuhlman, who's a master's student there. Over the course of 2024 and 2025, we're going to be tagging something like 250 to 300 northern saw-whet owls and collaborating with people like Mike Avera at University of Illinois, who's been tagging saw-whets for a number of years with Motus tags as well. And we're tagging these birds on the breeding grounds in Alaska and New England and even in the southern and central Appalachians and tracking them. This is the tracks these birds have been making on their way south. It feels really good. If you had told me in 2015 it was going to take this long to get to this point, I'm not sure I would have believed you, but here we are. So we've got this incredible new revolutionary technique for this new technology to help us understand bird migration and figure out ways to save migratory birds. But we don't have to wait for that information to do good things for migratory birds. One of the most important things you can do for migratory birds rests every morning in your coffee cup. And if that seems like an odd thing to say, let me explain to you why shade-grown coffee is so important for migratory birds. I would imagine we have more than a few coffee drinkers on this call this evening. If you are one of those people who cannot start your day without coffee, and I am married to one of them, let me explain to you why what you put in your cup makes all the difference in the world for migratory birds. So if I show you these three pictures and ask you to pick out the picture that shows a crop under cultivation, well, obviously the one on the upper right corner where everything's planted in nice, neat lines. Except that all three of these are pictures of coffee under cultivation. The difference is the other two pictures represent what are known as traditional or rustic shade coffee farms. This is the way coffee was raised in the Caribbean and Latin America since time immemorial, where a farmer would go into the shade of an existing, intact, functioning, biodiverse forest and plant these widely scattered coffee shrubs. And the coffee would ripen slowly in the shade of the forest and develop complexities of aroma and flavor that you just don't get growing coffee out in the open. And that, as I said, is the way that we have traditionally raised coffee, but it is increasingly not the way coffee is raised today. Most of the coffee that is sold in the United States is what's known as sun-tolerant coffee. And this is coffee that is grown in what used to be intact, functioning, biodiverse forests, but which have been bulldozed and clear-cut and then planted with these sun-tolerant coffee varieties, what's known as Robusta coffee, that is soaked in insecticides and fungicides and chemical fertilizers. They produce really high yields of really bad coffee. It's the cheap stuff that you buy in cans. And in the process, it takes what had been incredibly important bird habitat and converts it into the biological equivalent of a parking lot. Because traditional shade coffee plantations in Latin America and the Caribbean support hundreds of species of migratory birds. Western tanagers, chestnut-sided warblers, Baltimore orioles, solitary vireos. These birds, or excuse me, blue-headed vireos, old guy, still thinking of them as solitary vireos. The problem when you learn these names when you're a kid, you never quite forget them. Some of these birds use shade coffee plantations as migratory habitat, stopover habitat as they're moving back and forth between North America and South America. Some of them, like Tennessee warblers, shade coffee plantations are among their most important wintering habitats. The problem is there's a whole lot less of those shade coffee plantations than there used to be. About 40 to 50% of the shade coffee plantations in Latin America have been lost in recent decades, and we are the reason for that. Americans drink about a third of the world's coffee supply, and Americans like cheap coffee. The problem is there is no such thing as cheap coffee. There's inexpensive coffee, but the birds pay the price for that. And so by choosing the right coffee, that can make all the difference for migratory birds. And the right coffee is Smithsonian bird-friendly certified coffee. There are a number of coffee certification programs out there, some of which are better or worse than others. Some of them have watered their criteria down to the point where they are absolutely meaningless. It pains me to say that the Rainforest Alliance, the little green tree frog, is one of those. They will certify as shade coffee that's grown in full sun and not organic. Whereas the bird-friendly certification from the Smithsonian Migratory Bird Center at the National Zoo. First, it's the most rigorous certification program out there. It requires USDA organic certification. And there is a raft of peer-reviewed science to show that it is the gold standard. It has the highest biodiversity among any of the coffee systems out there. If you want to be sure that the coffee that you are buying is good for birds, look for that bird-friendly certification label on there. This is what bird-friendly habitat looks like. These are the highlands of northern Nicaragua near the town of San Juan del Rio Coco. What you are looking at to the horizon is bird-friendly certified USDA or organic certified shade coffee. Hundreds of small, generally family-owned farms, part of several large cooperatives that are based out of San Juan del Rio Coco, all of them USDA certified, all of them bird-friendly certified. And the premium price that they get for their coffee is allowing these folks to do things like creating a native tree nursery where they can grow thousands and thousands of native trees, species of native trees, so that they can reforest degraded old grain fields and cattle pastures. This is one part of the world where migratory bird habitat is increasing, not decreasing, where places are being reforested rather than deforested. And I've seen this myself. I've traveled down to this part of northern Nicaragua a couple of times, and between my first visit and my second visit 5 or 6 years later, the difference on the ground was astonishing. It was also some of the best birding I've ever had in Latin America. These shade coffee plantations, as I said, they're generally small family-owned farms. So they're keeping the land in these families. And the shade coffee plantations provide more than just coffee. You can grow the farmers. Marvin there in the upper right is holding a cacao pod. They often grow cacao for chocolate on these plantations. They grow vanilla orchids. That's that plant growing on the tree trunk. It turns out vanilla orchids do really well in the shade of these large canopy trees. Marvin also in that particular farm grows specialty flowers for the cut flower trade. Even the wood that they prune from these coffee shrubs, which need to be done on a fairly regular basis, has a particular use. There's a bit of a fad right now in Europe for furniture made from coffee wood. So here's the thing. If you are buying your coffee in a can in the grocery store, you are buying coffee that is actively destroying bird habitat. Please don't do that. If you are buying a specialty coffee, maybe it's good for birds, maybe it's not. Just because it's organic certified doesn't necessarily mean that it's shade grown. To be honest with you, just because the label says shade grown doesn't really mean a lot, because a lot of what is sold as shade grown coffee is what's known as technified shade, where they bulldoze the forest, they plant the coffee, and then they plant some widely scattered Australian eucalyptus trees to provide a little bit of shade. So you have choice. And if you're not buying your coffee in a can, if you're buying some sort of a specialty coffee, the bird-friendly certified coffee is not any more expensive than the stuff that you're buying at the grocery store or Starbucks or wherever. If you're interested in finding more, it's relatively easy to do. Pointed out there, my good friend and colleague Bridget Stutchberry, who just retired after a long career as one of the North America's great ornithologists at York University in Canada. In her book, The Silence of the Songbirds, she talks about, the steam rising from your coffee mug and the ghosts of the warblers in the forest. If you're buying cheap coffee at the grocery store, it is literally the ghosts of the birds that used to live on that land. And my good friend Ken Kaufman, somebody was mentioning Ken a little bit earlier before the talk started. Ken has been asking this question for years, simply why aren't more birders specifically asking for bird-friendly coffee? If you're interested in finding out where you can buy it, go to the Smithsonian Migratory Bird Center's website. They have a whole section there on bird-friendly coffee. They're also now certifying bird-friendly cacao. You can figure out where to buy it. You can buy it in stores. Whole Foods sells a bird-friendly, one of their Allegro roasts is bird-friendly. There are a number of mail order companies that will roast it and send it right to your door. It's one of the most effective things that you can do for birds, and it's one of the simplest. Look, if you're a coffee drinker, you're going to drink coffee every day. So why not give the birds a hand up and drink the coffee that's going to actually help them rather than the coffee that's going to destroy their habitat? The birds are already doing everything they can. They need our help every way that they can get it.
Is there still a need to add more towers, specifically here in central Illinois? What is required? And if funds need to be raised, how much?
So under ideal conditions, the range of a Motus receiver station is about 15 kilometers. So what we have tended to do with our Northeast Motus collaboration installations is to try to space these things about 30 kilometers apart. Now, certainly having more of them a rising tide lifts all boats. You don't want to put one right next to an existing tower. That's just duplicating effort. As far as expense goes, there's there's a million different ways to put these things up, from freestanding towers with guy lines, without guy lines, co-located on existing communication towers, on the side of buildings, on fire towers. Um, and do you have to have a solar array? Can you plug it into existing power? Is it going to be connected to the internet? Is there going to be a digital, is it going to be going through the cellular network? There's a million different ways to skin that cat. We usually say somewhere between $4,000 and $8,000 will cover the cost, the equipment cost of setting up one of these receiver stations. But like I said, there's just a million different ways that you can do it. The other thing you need to bear in mind is the topography, because this is VHF radio, so it's a line of sight. If you've got hills, if you've got buildings, if you've got dense forest, if you're in a low area, probably not a really good spot for a tower. The other thing that you have to think about is electromagnetic radiation and interference on those frequencies. We have set up a couple of stations over the years through the Northeast Motus collaboration where there was so much noise that we just had to take them down, because the number of, I mean, the data charges, because we were sending this information, we're sending the data in by the cell system. The data charges were just killing us, and we weren't getting a lot of good data from them. We were getting a lot of false positives. For example, we had one station in Pennsylvania that thought it detected a Magellanic oyster catcher from southern South America. It thought it detected a Guyanan cock of the rock from South America. Pretty sure neither of those species of birds were in central Pennsylvania. So, there's a lot of things that you have to look at here, but it's not rocket science. It's a relatively straightforward process. A lot of folks, have taken it on themselves, local Audubon chapters, bird clubs, to raise money to set these things up. And they're really great. They're great at schools. They're great at nature centers. Even if the site isn't necessarily the best for migration monitoring, just being able to show folks that, what species of birds, bats, and insects are flying by, is a really powerful educational tool.
Another person has asked, can you please talk about the relationships that must be developed with states and countries where birds migrate to and through?
Ooh. You mean I would imagine that means in terms of conservation. And that is an absolutely critical point. And there have been a lot of efforts over the years. Partners in Flight was one of the earliest. The idea of creating this sort of transnational movement of NGOs and state and federal and provincial agencies, all working, collaboratively, pulling in the same direction. The U.S. Forest Service has what they call its Southern Wings Initiative, where U.S. Forest Service expertise is used in Latin America and the Caribbean. There are groups, I mentioned Birds Caribbean earlier, that it's a U.S.-based group. Well, that's not really quite true. Their executive director lives in the U.S., but it's a Caribbean-based and Caribbean-driven group. You know, those of us who work in migratory bird conservation recognize that the only way you can affect real change is by working across boundaries, because of course the birds completely ignore those boundaries. It can be challenging. Not every government entity in other parts of the world is as interested in bird conservation as we might wish them to be. There are times when not every government entity here in the Northern Hemisphere is as focused on bird conservation as we might wish they would be as well. But we are making progress. And I think that the information we're getting from Motus and from other similar kind of big data-driven initiatives like eBird. eBird is giving us an incredible amount of information about where these birds are going. I mean, I showed you that status and trend map for wood thrushes. What I didn't mention is that all those little dots, all those little blue and red and white dots on that map are about 27 kilometers wide, and Cornell has like 120 some variables for each one of those. And it is going to be possible in the very near future on an almost mile by mile basis to figure out what the problems are for the same species of migratory birds in many different parts of its range. Because of course, with many of these birds, it's not just one thing everywhere. It's, death by a thousand cuts and different problems in different parts of their range. And we are at the cusp of cracking that code and figuring out where the problems are and how to start to fix them.
The next question is, how is the data aggregated for an individual scientist? In other words, how do they find the data for the birds they're studying?
So those of us who have projects on Motus, we have access to the raw data that we can download and use statistical packages like R to analyze. That kind of information is not available to the public. There are scientists who are doing their master's degrees and their PhDs using this data, and there's some proprietary protections that are given to those data. So it's possible to download specifically what you need, but it's also possible with the collaboration of other scientists, and there's more and more of this happening, where folks are, as you say, aggregating those data and looking at big picture issues, big picture questions. One of the things that we're looking for funding for right now is to try to create the kind of tools that will make it easier for scientists to ask those big sweeping questions across, as I said, this fire hose of data. There's so much information coming in. I didn't get into this, but there's one element of Motus, what are known as nodes, where you can essentially set up like a hyper local network to track these tags using what are known as life tags, these 434 megahertz tags that CTT in New Jersey makes. And you can set up a network of like 150 of these hyper local nodes in across a couple hundred acres, and literally know almost on a foot by foot, second by second basis where a bird is. And one of my colleagues is working with this kind of technology and finding out that birds have buddies, that different species of birds have a tendency during migration and during stopover to hang out with each other, which we never knew before because it's been too damn hard to track even a single bird moment to moment. But by putting these transmitters on these birds and letting the automation run it and then looking at all the data, I mean, Luke's getting like tens of thousands of hits a day, millions of hits a week. It's an incredible amount of data, but it's giving us a window into the moment by moment lives of these birds, exactly what kind of micro habitats they're using on stopover, gives us an idea of what kind of foods they're looking for. These questions that we've never had the ability to answer before that we do. It's every age thinks it's the golden age of something. If you'd asked ornithologists 100 years ago, they would have said it was the golden age of ornithology because they had smokeless powder for shooting birds for their museum collections. But it really feels like a golden age of ornithology right now.
Another question came in regarding bird-friendly coffee versus rainforest type of coffee. And the question was, how has Motus confirmed all these assertions in relation to bird-friendly plantations?
Well, I don't know that Motus has necessarily been confirming that. I mean, what's confirmed it is on the ground surveys, frankly, by folks like the Smithsonian Migratory Bird Center, kind of ground truthing the certification that the area, the shade coffee farms that are certified bird friendly have a higher diversity, not just of birds, but of birds and bats and orchids and reptiles and amphibians, insects, especially some of the orchid bees, for example, that are critical pollinators in the rainforest. The information is pretty clear that of all of the certification programs out there that have been compared, bird-friendly certification is, as I said before, it's the gold standard. It's kind of the top of the heap.
Here's a more of a little technical question with regards to how the system is deployed. How are the birds or insects captured, and how are the transmitters attached to the birds or
Great,
insects?
great question. Great question. So as far as catching the birds, mist nets, the way any bird bander would use to catch the bird. As far as fitting them on, they usually use what's known as a rappel harness, R-A-P-P-O-L-E, named for the scientists that came up with it. It's basically a fanny pack for the bird. Little elastic, same kind of elastic stuff that they make kids' necklaces out of, something called Stretch Magic. Just a little loop that goes up over the top of the legs, and so that the transmitter sits just right in the middle of what's known as the sensacrum, which is the flat part at the base of the spine. So it's sitting over the center of the bird's gravity. The antenna sticks out the back. And whatever species of bird we are tagging, regardless of whether we're using one of those big transmitters I showed you on snowy owls or a little tiny transmitter on a hummingbird, we researchers are not allowed to put anything on the bird, the transmitter, the harness, and the leg band that weighs more than 3% of the bird's body weight, which seems to be a safe threshold based on years and years of experience with radio telemetry of various sorts. As far as insects go, they usually use a dab of glue. So, and I have not done any insect tagging myself. Some of my colleagues at New Hampshire Audubon have been doing a lot of tagging of monarchs. They usually tag them on the thorax. The glue will come off after a length of time because those transmitters are relatively short-lived. You know, the length of the transmitter, the transmitter life is based on battery life, and you can't put a heavy battery on a monarch butterfly. So they're usually going to last anywhere from a couple of weeks to a couple of months, just depending on how the transmitter's been programmed.
There's not a local source for Smithsonian bird-friendly coffee that I'm aware of. Mail order is the only option.
If you go on the Smithsonian website, there is a finder feature on there that you can plug in your zip code and it'll tell you the nearest retailer. The other thing you can do is talk to your local coffee retailer. If you buy from a specialty shop, ask them to stock a bird-friendly roast. I mean, it's not like bird-friendly coffee all comes from a single source. Anybody who knows the coffee business will know ways to get Smithsonian bird-friendly coffee, but they need to be asked. And they may tell you, oh, well, you know, we've got this shade-grown coffee. And you can say, well, okay, but is that certified? Is it Smithsonian certified shade-grown coffee? Because unfortunately, I've talked to a lot of coffee retailers and roasters over the years, and these are good, well-meaning people who don't necessarily know a whole lot about bird conservation. And they'll say, well, you know, I visited the farm in Mexico and there were birds all over the place. Well,
Yeah.
okay, but or you know they treat their you know it's fair trade coffee and they treat their workers really well. Well, that's great, but if you're interested in driving home the point that you want to try to protect bird habitat and increase bird habitat, that's the way to do it, is to get people to drink more bird-friendly coffee.
We really appreciate your taking the time to talk to us about the Motus Towers and the bird-friendly coffee. So we thank you very much for the presentation.